Hey there, how you doing? And welcome back to Archaeology 273. This week we are going to travel to the Eastern Woodlands, and there are a number of topics that I want to explore and with you. And they are, in this first video, we're going to be looking at the origins of agriculture in the Eastern Woodlands area. Then after that, we will look at the various mound building complexes that are all throughout this culture area. And then we're going to move into a couple of case studies, some research, a friend and colleague of mine at the University of Georgia, and she does Iroquoian archaeology in southern Ontario. The area, as you will see in the third and fourth video, are the territories of the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois, and the Huron-Wendat peoples, who have a long history of not getting along. Anyhow, we're going to look at one case study that involves the stylistic, statistical analysis of ceramics in between these various groups. And then the last video will be about the what is referred to in archaeology, a growing theme of research is coalescence, or settlements coming together from, once there were many settlements all over the landscape and they congregate. And so what are the factors, both internally and externally, that those communities faced? So anyhow, the Eastern Woodlands, as we will see, is, you can see in the lecture slide here, the culture areas of North America. And the Eastern Woodlands is typically divided into the northeastern and southeastern woodland regions. And there's some good reasons for this, as we will explore throughout these lecture videos. And so I'm going to introduce the geography and the environment of the area generally. We're going to look at, again, the transition, the beginnings of agriculture, which is known as cultivation, and the shift from cultivation to all-out agriculture. There's a very interesting site that we'll talk about in one of the videos, is Poverty Point. And of course, the Adena and Hopewell mound building complexes, and the great city of Cahokia, which is near the modern-day town of St. Louis. And then we'll get into those case study examples of Iroquoian archaeology. So here in this lecture slide, you can see the environment of this very large area. Of course, in the south, it's very warm. The vegetation does change north to south, generally transitioning from mostly deciduous trees to more coniferous trees at the northern border of this culture area. And what really characterizes the Eastern Woodlands are its numerous waterways, everything from the huge Mississippi River and to many other smaller rivers that drain into the Atlantic instead of the Gulf of Mexico. And of course, there are the Great Lakes, which is a very defining characteristic of the northeastern woodlands. And these water bodies play a very important role in the travel and movement of people and materials, which is something else that we'll explore throughout this week's region. And so also running up and down in a north-south axis are the Appalachian Mountains. And these are range from sort of small hills to some fairly high elevation peaks. And again, these the Appalachian Mountains are another distinctive feature of this culture area. And we can also look at it here in this map of North America, the different kinds of vegetation, and you can see the variation depending on elevation, north-south location, and so on, that it gives you an idea of the distribution of the vegetation in the environment. And so what I really want to focus on now is the human interaction between the environment and, in this case, plants. And in archaeology, we have populations who are hunter-gatherers, hunter-fisher-gatherers, but when cultures decide to have a focus on the taking care of plants, mostly for dietary reasons. This is where we see the what is known as incipient cultivation. And cultivation, in archaeological terms, is the use of plants. In some areas, and here in British Columbia in the interior, Indigenous groups burnt off sides of mountains to encourage the growth of berries and other plants. And so this is a modification of the environment that would have the plants would flourish. So you would have more food. And so over time, we're talking about hundreds of years, even thousands of years in some cases, when people start tending to these plants and selecting certain traits, then we see the transition from cultivating wild plants into the tending of domesticated plant species. And this is outright agriculture. And we will look at this process in a number of times in different areas across the continent. And so cultivation is raising plants for human use, and through the deliberate modification of how they propagate or how they become more abundant. And this is generally done by many cultures around the world, and it gives you a stable food supply. You can rely on certain foods. But here in cultivation, plants are still in nature, and so they're not in sort of agricultural fields or tended plots or gardens. Whereas agriculture is the purposeful selection of plants and what you favor about that plant. And we will see this with corn. It has a very interesting history. And so this is where, with agriculture, this is where plants are grown in plots or in fields that are tended. And as we will see here in the Eastern Woodlands and other areas, how you plant these particular species is really important for their abundance and, of course, your interest in your own health. And there is regional variation on how and why people selected certain plants for agriculture, and we'll explore that throughout the semester. So in early archaeological investigations about southeastern agriculture, it was, back in the 60s and 70s, it was kind of thought that agriculture was adopted from the Southwest and Mesoamerica, where there is a longer history of investigation there. And this would have been done through trade and exchange with groups from different areas. And eventually, certain plants would be kind of imported, and people would start growing them here in the Eastern Woodlands area. And so, recent research, as we will see, looking at specific plants and through the lens of archaeobotany, or the study of archaeological plant remains, we now know that the development of agriculture in the Eastern Woodlands was in situ. It happened within the culture area under its own terms. And this really was beneficial, as we will see when we talk about mounds and other things, large communities. It provided a diverse array of abundant food supply. And I don't know if any of you remember the economic crisis in the mid-2000s. The United States, Canada, many other nations around the world, the economy just crashed, and people had a pretty hard time. I was living in Hamilton at the time, and many people who worked in car factories and other industries were all out of work. And so the governments at that time provided what were known as stimulus packages for people. And this is keep that idea of stimulus package when we talk about agriculture. It really kicked things into gear and caused a lot of cultural change, which we'll explore throughout this week. And I mentioned archaeobotany. It is the methods and techniques and theories within archaeology that relate to the way ancient peoples around the world utilize plants. And here in this lecture slide, you can see this archaeologist using a technique called flotation. And you can see there's a large cistern with water in there, and it's slowly sort of overflowing into the screen. And what in flotation, you can guess what happens here, that the plant materials, the seeds, the rinds, the stems, and so on, plants that are plant remains that are found in archaeological sites through sediment samples float to the top. And when they float to the top, they go, the water overflows from that basin, and you can see the water coming out, and there's the screen, and that's where the plant remains are collected. And archaeologists can then take these into a lab where they have comparative collections through doing experiments of burning and charring plant remains to compare and identify what species of plant or plants that were being used in any particular archaeological site. And this is a somewhat time-consuming technique, but it can be very informative because it tells us, one, about people's diets, two, it tells us about the environment in which they lived, and three, where they, are either just cultivating or are they involved in outright agriculture. So yeah, archaeobotany can offer us a lot of information about past lifeways. So let's get into some of the specific plants. There's the Ozark wild gourd, or gourds, and these are things that look like squashes, right, and pumpkins and so on. In archaeological terms, there are a lot of gourds that have been used for a very long time, particularly in South and Central America. But here in the Eastern Woodlands, my Latin isn't very good, Cucurbita pepo ovifera is the Latin scientific name for these Ozark wild gourds. And these were first initially cultivated at sites where they've been identified at Phillips Springs in Missouri as far back as 8,000 years ago. And so, yeah, people were already cultivating things 8,000 years ago. So, yeah, that goes back quite a ways. And eventually they developed into the Ozark wild gourd, into domesticated varieties. And we now know through archaeobotanical research throughout the Eastern Woodlands that the process of domesticating these varied gourds took about 3,500 to 4,000 years, and they were fully domesticated by 4,500 BP. And and through that process of domestication, you start getting selection for certain traits, and you get different types of gourds. They might have different textures for food. Others might be just hollowed out and used as storage vessels. Then we also have the sunflower, and Helianthus innis, and it was originally from the plains region, those sort of prairie grasslands. And they were sort of brought in, of course, because sunflowers have a huge abundance of sunflower seeds, which are very tasty and give you some different kinds of fats for your diet and some variation. And it was human intervention that brought sunflower into the Eastern Woodlands area. And here in this lecture slide, it might be on this side or this side. Anyhow, is a carbonized example from an archaeological site in Tennessee known as the Hayes site, where this one, we can the other thing about these charred remains is that we can directly AMS radiocarbon date them to figure out when they were being utilized. And in this case, it's 4,840 years ago. That's almost 5,000 years old. And so keep an eye on these. You don't have to remember all the radiocarbon dates that I mention in these lectures, but just keep an eye on the pattern that you're going to see. So the previous one was about 4,500 years ago. This one here is about 4,800 years ago. Keep that in mind, all right? Then we have quinopods, plants very similar to spinach. And leafy greens, of course, are great for your diet. I eat a spinach salad almost every day. It's very good. And of course, the variant of quinopods in the Eastern Woodlands is lamb's quarter, and you could see those leafy greens in the or in the lecture slide, and they're also known as goosefit or just wild spinach. And this plant occurs in the wild all the way from Mexico throughout much of the eastern United States. And we have archaeobotanical evidence of it being used as far back as 8,500 years ago. But it wasn't fully domesticated until about 3,700 years ago from some sites in Kentucky. And so, again, 37, 45, 48,100 years ago, you can sort of see a pattern here. But the big plant species that really change things in the Eastern Woodlands and other areas of North America and Central and South America, for that matter, is corn. And so, yeah, let's get a little corny. It was actually introduced. It was one of the plants that was truly introduced from probably the American Southwest around 1800 BP. And so over the next 600 years, corn was adopted into the domesticated plots, those gourds, those the domesticated spinach and other plants that we've already talked about throughout the region. And by 1200 BP, corn became the staple food throughout the region. And so here in this map lecture slide, you can see the sort of movement of corn that we can trace through the archaeological record from area to area in North, Central, and South America. And so, originally, as we will see later in the semester, we'll talk about corn more in different areas. The ancestral plant of corn is known as teosinte. And here in this lecture slide, you can sort of see the changes that we can observe in the morphology of archaeobotanical remains from sites from all these areas. The change in from teosinte to corn. And essentially what was being selected here were the number of rows and total number of kernels. And so when you look at corn, modern day corn, it's like you get some really big stalks that have a lot of kernels on them. And so that's a lot of food. And so this is an example of that selection process happening. And we can see this in the archaeological record. So, but in the Eastern Woodlands, we don't have wild teosinte. So that's how we know it was brought in from somewhere else. Teosinte occurs in the American Southwest and more so down in Mesoamerica, where the domestication of corn, as we will see later in the semester, started at the earliest times. And here you can see some charred corn kernels, and people did cook and process their food in various ways. And actually, when I was filming Wild Archaeology in Season 2, the site in London, Ontario, we actually found, well, I didn't find, one of my co-hosts, Jen, found some charred corn kernels, just like these ones. They preserve really well in the archaeological record, and typically they are found within ceramic vessels, but also in house floor deposits. But there's also, we know in the development of agriculture in the Eastern Woodlands that people would set aside some of the corn as seed corn. It would be dried, okay? And so would you do this? It's like, why don't you just eat all your corn? Well, you need seed corn for the next year's crop. And so having an abundant supply of seeds, you can plant those corn kernels, and you can continue to grow this plant at a very large scale. And so there are some limitations to agriculture and the growing of corn and other plant species in the Eastern Woodlands. These range from the type of soil, from area to area across the region. The soils are not all the same. They tend to be more fertile further south in the northeastern woodlands, areas like southern Ontario and the southern shores of the Great Lakes are also very fertile, but not as much as we see along the Mississippi River, where there is a lot of nutrients being brought by that river and its flooding of its banks and so on. Another really important factor is the number of frost-free days. And of course, you have a longer, warmer growing season the further south you go. And the further north you go, there's a shorter growing season, less sun, and less hours of sun per day. And of course, there is the role of other vegetation. And, when you're doing agriculture, wild plants tend to come into competition. They're after nutrient soils and such as well. And this we'll get into swidden farming or slash and burn agriculture. And this was practiced, throughout the Eastern Woodlands on a large scale. And essentially people in various areas would burn off large plots of natural forest, i.e. woodlands, and the charred remains would actually provide a lot of nutrients for the agricultural plants that would then be grown in that location. But we also have to consider in the archaeological record what happens to human populations with agriculture. Generally, there's a trend that human populations will grow and become quite large. And what happens when they get too big? So keep that in mind as we move along. And also, when we sort of see a shift from hunting and gathering to cultivation to outright agriculture, there's going to be changes in social and political organization. Certain people are going to want to be leaders. Certain people want to be managers. Certain people might be, there might be more time for spiritual beliefs and so on. So these are all factors that we have to consider when we look at the transition of cultivation to agriculture in the Eastern Woodlands. And here in this lecture slide, you can see a modern day example of swidden agriculture or slash and burn. And this may seem like a destructive practice, but it's quite common around the world and how people feed themselves through agriculture. And in the Eastern Woodlands, large areas would be burnt off, but they would actually grow back fairly quickly. And this is something we'll get into because there's a certain amount of years before the soils in these agricultural plots and fields become less nutrient because the agricultural plants suck up all the nutrients. And so that's going to be a factor that we'll get into more as we move along. So, I mentioned that time from about 1800 BP to about 1200 BP earlier, and the introduction of corn throughout the region. And corn is a C13 plant, and when you eat corn, a lot of this isotope of carbon-13, gets absorbed into your bones. And so you literally are what you eat. And what we see in human burials that have been found in archaeological sites across the Eastern Woodlands is, you can see in the lecture slide, the plot, all those dots, this steep rise in around just after 1200 BP. And this is how we can tell through stable isotope analysis a shift in human diet. And here, corn, we can see skyrockets because those carbon-13 values get up really high. It becomes a very major part of the food source. And so, when you have a lot more food, generally populations tend to start growing. And also, the larger your agricultural fields are, the more of a food surplus you will have. And so this is very important for getting through lean times of the year, the fall and the winter, when things just don't really grow all that well, even in the Eastern Woodlands and for areas that are further south. And so what we see in village sites and town city sites across the region that we'll talk more about later are these large pits that were sometimes lined with stone, kind of like a masonry, and these are essentially cellars. You dig into the ground and down into the earth, and things are kept cool. These are essentially ancient refrigerators. And so the largest of these in the Eastern Woodlands could fit 30 bushels of corn. Okay, so I don't know if any of you have grown up on a farm or anything. My dad did in southern Ontario. And I asked him, what's a bushel? Well, a bushel is about 56 pounds. Okay, as you can see in this lecture slide, a basket of 56 pounds of corn. That's quite a bit of corn, right? So 30 bushels, that's, we're talking about 1,680 pounds or 764 kilograms of corn in just one pit refrigerator. And so that's a lot of surplus of food. And why would you need a surplus, right? Well, I mentioned getting through leaner months of the year, but also this is probably an indicator in the archaeological record that there are higher populations of people. You just plainly have more mouths to feed, right? People having more kids and things are great, right? We've got lots of food. Things are stable, right? And even in this day and age, when I go home after work and go, oh, gee, there's not much food in the fridge, you get kind of worried because, like, what am I going to feed my daughter for supper? Anyhow, yeah, food security is very important. And even in modern day, we see this historical trend of the corn yield here in the, as you can see in this graph from the United States. And this is a little artificial because the American government likes to kind of try and have innovative industry, and they're using corn as a biofuel. And so this production of corn is, yes, for human consumption and part of the global economy, but it is also very much driven by other purposes, such as biofuel. And so just to wrap up, one of the very important things that we'll observe as we move along is this concept of companion planting. And in the Eastern Woodlands, I mentioned corn. There's also beans. I didn't get much into beans, and squash. And when you plant these three species together, they really get along. It's like, they're like, yeah, party. One, I mentioned corn really sucks a lot of nutrients out of the soils. Well, beans and squash actually deposit nitrogen into the soils as they grow. And so what takes up the nitrogen? The corn. And so these plants are very often found in conjunction with each other in the archaeological record. And here you can see in this picture, this is a reconstructed Iroquois palisaded village site that I got to visit while filming season 2 of Wild Archaeology. A plot within the village of companion planted plants, corns, beans, and squash. And you can see beans and squash tend to like to have a small mound. And this little mound, as you can sort of see in this image, it helps to retain water. And of course, corn also needs a regular supply of water to grow. And so people really figured this out. They came up with a great system that provided a wealth and abundance of food that was healthy and nutritious. And so we'll see what the implications of this are through the mound building complexes and the various things that we can see socially and politically in the archaeological record in the next video. So that's it for this one. And I'll also come up with some discussion questions and post those on Canvas. So I'll see you in the next video. Till then, laters.